this computer. Good. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to say welcome to this series of ethics forums. I'm Ian Terry, and I'm the rector of St. Peter's Church. You can see it pictured behind me. Now, I don't live there the whole time. I've just learned to manage the backgrounds for Zoom. This time last year, I was welcoming the participants to ethics forums, actually to St. Peter's Church building. And that was fantastic in a wide range of ways. One of them was that anybody who wanted to could just wander in from the streets. Some people would have planned to come, others would wander in, and everybody could be part of talking about ethical decisions, about taking ownership of ethical decisions and learning to become better, which to me is a lifetime thing, at listening to other people respectfully and recognizing that there are many, many other opinions than your own in the world. So last year we were, as I said, actually in St. Peter's Church. Today we're online. The advantages of being online, and we're online perforce, you know, because of COVID, but the advantages of being online are actually that we can welcome, I think, a much wider range of people. And we have lined up for us for over the next 10 weeks, in each case, using the same hyperlink that you've used to get into today's meeting. We have a very wide range of great panelists and of others and some really fantastic discussions lined up. Can I just say to you that we are recording this discussion today. And so if you haven't signed, it can be typing your name in by way of signing a consent form to consent for the view of you that these lovely little thumbnail views of you that we have on video, and the recording of your voice if you speak. We hope you will. If you haven't signed a consent form, could you do so, please? Not at this moment, because let's concentrate on the discussion, but sometime in the next few days, and get it into me or to Katie. That will be great. I've really enjoyed planning this series of ethics forums with Katie Starkey and enjoyed the partnership with Dorset Police. And that cues me to hand over to Detective Chief Superintendent Ben Hargreaves, who is going to chair today's session, and he will introduce both the topic and the panelists, and he will hold the rings, as they say, for the whole of this session. And ladies and gentlemen, you could not be in better hands. Enjoy the forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I think it's the right point just to acknowledge Ian's work here, because had it not been for Ian, we wouldn't be here today having this really important discussion, and certainly wouldn't be in our second season. And when we set up these talks, these get-togethers, it was very much to recognise the need in modern society to make space, actively make space for ethical discussion. So that's what we're going to do today. The way that the meeting will run, as Ian said, I'll introduce the topic or the provocation. We'll then go to our panel members for their thoughts on the subject in hand. And then after that, we'll open up to questions and get our panel members' opinions, ideas, and trigger some debate. And if today is anything similar to those that have gone before, we often end up in a place far removed from where we started, with some really interesting questions and lines of discussion. So my two panel members today are, firstly, if I could just introduce you, and if you could say a very short piece about yourselves, that would be helpful for everybody. So firstly, Father Andrew Wagstaff.
Thank you, Ben. My name's Andrew Wagstaff. I'm a Catholic priest and I belong to the congregation of the Oratory. My brothers and I look after the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in the middle of Bournemouth. We're on Richmond Hill. And I also look after the Catholic students at the Bournemouth University and the Arts University Bournemouth.
Thank you very much. And if I could come to Danny Tamblyn.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danny Tamblyn. I'm the Neighbourhood Policing Inspector for North Bournemouth. I've been a police officer for 23 years. The vast majority of that time has been spent in the world of public order and public safety. I've worked as a trainer in that field, a tactical advisor to senior officers, and now as a senior officer myself, I'm a public order, public safety commander.
Thanks very much, Danny. And Ian kindly introduced me at the start. I'm Ben Hargreaves, and I'm Head of Crime and Criminal Justice for Dorset Police. So now we come to the ethical question for today. As I said, I'll introduce the question, and when we come to the point where I open it up to the floor, what I will do, and maybe have to rely on Ian's help here, just to spot hands, people waving at the appropriate moment, so I don't miss anybody, because we're a bit restricted about what can be seen at any one time. Hello, Andrew.
And could I just say, I think Izzy's also on our panel today as well.
Oh, sorry, I do apologise.
Could you introduce herself as well, please?
I've got a different note. I do apologise.
Hi there. Should I speak now? Yeah.
Please do. Yeah.
No problem. Yes. So I'm Isabel. I'm the director of March for Life UK, and the co-director of the co-director of March for Life UK, and the director of 40 Days for Life in Birmingham, which are both pro-life organisations. And I'm happy to say a little bit more about that whenever it was appropriate.
That's great. Thank you very much, Izzy. And my sincere apologies for missing you off the introductions.
That's okay.
So if we come to the question in hand. So the ethics of protesting. Does anything go if your cause is just and your gripe is passionate? Does anything go if your cause is just and your gripe is passionate? Clearly a very topical issue at the moment. We in Dorset are seeing a number of protests on a regular basis, and of course the images of America very fresh in people's minds at the moment. So without further ado, if I can run through the panelists just one in turn, giving your initial thoughts and feelings on that provocation. So Izzy, could I come to you first, please?
Sure, yeah. So as I mentioned, they're both pro-life organisations that I work with, which would be opposing abortion. And so March for Life organises, amongst other things, public witnesses. So our main event that we hold once a year would be in London and would attract sort of 5,000 plus people. Obviously last year it was online, but we had smaller scale witnesses. 40 Days for Life consists of going outside an abortion centre in groups of 2 to offer help to those in crisis pregnancies or to those who are suffering after an abortion. So although from our perspective, we would say neither are primarily protests, we're there to offer help and create awareness. From a policing perspective, because these are both controversial issues on quite contentious subjects, they would be classed under the realm of protests, because there could be people with other opinions who might come, and it could be quite a contentious thing. So from a policing perspective, we are classed in the group of protests. So we have quite strict rules for both of the organisations. For instance, with 40 Days for Life outside abortion centres, anyone who works with us has to sign a statement of peace, to obey the law, to obey police directives, and to behave peacefully. Similarly, with the March for Life, people have to agree by our standards for their posters and banners, no offensive words. We hire a security team to make sure that's kept in place. Although by and large, we feel that the pro-life community does agree with this approach. So we would work within the law. We would be peaceful. We believe, as we're both Christian, both the movements are Christian movements, even though people who aren't Christian sometimes join them. We very much want to radiate God's love in what we're doing. So what we're doing doesn't come from a place of anger or frustration or self-righteousness, but we feel it's very important that our key motivation is love of God and love of our neighbour. So we feel that this is the way to actually create a change in our society is through love. So for that reason, we would never include any violence or never incite violence, either in our actions or in our words. We aim to work with the police before we have our March for Life. So we always have a meeting with the Met in London. With our 40 Days for Life in Birmingham, we have meetings with the police there and work with the local police there. So although there would be things like movements to create buffer zones outside abortion centres to move us away, we believe that because we work very carefully within the law, we're at pains to make sure that we obey everything that we should and even go that one step further. We hope that the law will protect us when and if we ever need protecting ourselves.
That's great. Thank you very much, Izzy. And as you've mentioned the police a lot there and your relationship with the police, it segues naturally into I think, Danny. So Danny, your perspective.
Thank you. So a very interesting point there. So thank you for that introduction. So from my perspective, then, the police role in any protest is to facilitate lawful protest. The key factor here is that it's not our job to take sides. It's not our job to show favour in any way, shape or form. It's our job to allow peaceful protest and, where necessary, to allow peaceful counter-protest. This is a balancing act for the most part, where we try and ensure that everybody has their say. Everybody is allowed to move as freely as possible. So both the protesters, the counter-protesters, and the majority of people who are involved on neither side. Addressing the question specifically, I think that there's a couple of key phrases there. The first part of does anything go? Yeah. Well, the law makes it quite clear that anything doesn't go. And I think it was very interesting to hear Izzy's view there in relation to the agreements that the protesters, or should I say the people who have a passionate viewpoint they want to put across, and a message they want to spread, are obliged to sign up for want of a better phrase, a code of conduct there that perhaps goes even further than the law as to what you would believe is acceptable and how you would want your cause to be represented by people that attend. In a similar way that the consultation with the police is a legal requirement under certain sections of the Public Order Act, the police can restrict certain protests and protest activity if there is an undue or serious disruption to the community or a serious disruption to the risk of health to members of the public. So if you think in terms of does anything go as long as your cause is just, I could stand and block access to a building all day, every day if I chose. That would be my right to protest being looked after, but whoever is being obstructed by me would not be allowed to go about their daily business. So the key message for me, I think, is one of balance. And from an ethical perspective, the principle of utilitarianism, maximizing utility, which I think leads into what hopefully will be part of the discussion as to who decides what is just and what is not just, and whose view on the day will win out. I was going to say trumps the other, but I thought it was the wrong word to use today.
Thanks very much, Danny. Andrew.
So obviously, I'm trying to come at the question from a Christian perspective. I would seek to distinguish between protest and resistance. Now, both protest and resistance might at times be justified, but we've got to distinguish between the two and know which one we're doing. So protest is peaceful, generally indirect. Resistance generally is direct and may not necessarily be peaceful. Now, I would seek to characterize Jesus as the quintessential protester, as the model of a protester. I would say that his view is summarized by what he said to Peter when he took out his sword in the Garden of Gethsemane: "Put your sword away, for those who live by the sword will die by the sword." He rejected resistance. He was the man of sorrows who didn't resist when they pulled out his beard and slapped his face, as Isaiah said. He was the lamb led to the slaughter, who said nothing in the face of injustice. His silence in front of his accusers was a form of protest itself, but an utterly peaceful form. I would, for example, characterize the entry into Jerusalem as a kind of a protest, when people went out to meet Jesus with palm branches, olive branches, when they chanted Hosanna to the highest. His response is to join in the protest, to mount a donkey and ride in with them as a symbol of what it was that he was seeking to bring. I want to sort of steal an idea from the evangelical preacher Rob Bell, who interpreted the healing of the man with the withered hand in Mark chapter 3. And now that happens to be today's gospel in the Catholic lectionary. It might also be in the Anglican lectionary. I don't know, but what Rob Bell says about that is he takes that line where Jesus notices that the people are or that some of the people present are waiting to try and catch him out to see if he heals on the Sabbath. And Mark says he looks around with anger. And Rob Bell says, well, yes, but what does he do with that anger? He says to the man, stretch out your hand, and he's healed. So he turns the anger that he feels at the hardness of heart of the others present. He turns that into an increase of peace in the world through his healing of the man. Now, you could say to me, all right, that's all very well, but what about the cleansing of the temple? Isn't that an exception to what you've just been saying? And I would admit that on some levels it is, that St. John tells us that Jesus made a whip of cords and that he overturned the money changers' tables and drove out the animals from the temple. But it never says, the gospel never says that Jesus struck another person with that whip. And actually the way that John interprets that as if you like, a prophecy of his own passion and death and resurrection, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. That actually points away from violence towards passion, towards voluntary suffering. And that perhaps is Jesus's greatest protest, the fact that he underwent suffering voluntarily as a protest against evil, against sin, against death. When the soldiers come out to arrest him, he says, why are you coming out to me with swords and clubs? Wasn't I sitting in the temple every day teaching? He makes a point of his own peacefulness in the face of that violence. So I would say that the Christian model of protest is one of being prepared at least to undergo violence and suffering, but not to commit it. And that we also have to be aware that, yes, the reaction to our protest can be one of violence. Jesus said, I came not to bring peace but a sword, because of the reaction that people would have against him and his followers. But nevertheless, he says, put your sword away. He's not prepared to allow violence to have a place in his protest.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And Andrew, you've drawn a really interesting and important distinction there between protest and resistance. And I'd just be very keen to explore that with the other two panelists. So helping us zone in or clarify on what we mean by this word protest, so that we can refine this discussion. So Izzy, can I come to you first?
Yeah, and as I was saying, we wouldn't actually class our own movements as being specifically or primarily ones of protest. So it's not that we're there, although I would, from my own personal perspective, I would love to see the law changed to do with abortion. I know that's not what we're here to discuss, but just to do with the work that I do. But that isn't primarily what I'm seeking when I'm going organising groups outside the abortion centre. We are there to offer help, to offer support to those women who are vulnerable there. So we don't have, placards and things that you might associate more with a protest.
They have in the past though, certainly because they've been.
So yeah, and then with March for Life, what we would be doing then, we're creating awareness of the hurt and the damage that abortion causes. So I suppose there's some levels of that which maybe would be more into a sort of into the realms of a protest, but even there it's more of educational and motivating rather than just to protest a law. We're actually there more to educate the public and our sort of our own supporters on that subject. So I suppose it depends what your motivation would be. And as I said, that's not our primary motivation, although it would be something that I would be happy with if we were trying to kind of campaign to get a law change with the work that we're doing on those two public witness events.
Great, thank you. And same question to Danny.
Yes, it's an interesting position I find myself in. So I'm going to be, I won't say I'll sit on the fence, but I'll very much give you my view as Danny, the police officer, as opposed to Danny, the individual, because that is important. I'll do that, not as a cop-out as such, but because as an individual, I don't get to have my say in my role as a police officer, which is a benefit from yourselves, because we have a large group of individuals here who may have very differing views. What I would say is it's an interesting distinction between protest and resistance. And if we're not careful, as long as we believe that an individual believes their cause is just and they are passionate about it, it's protest. If they don't, it's resistance. Now, arguably, there's a place where resistance does have its place to bring around change. And the purpose of protest is to resist against something that is felt to be unjust. The other key issue I think that was raised was that use of violence or not. Now, that can be a key indicator that a lawful protest is turning unlawful or is intended to be unlawful. But with respect to Jesus, if he were today to come into a temple and overturn tables and wave a whip around, he would likely get arrested in terms of the potential harassment or alarm or distress that might have been caused by onlookers within that area, how they feel about that action. So we have to be, I think, from an ethical perspective, be willing to universalize our thoughts and processes, that if a group that we didn't agree with and were counter-protesting, for want of a better phrase, were to act in that same manner, would we look at it as resistance or would we choose to look at it as protest? So we can't have, in I suppose the simplest layperson's terms, one rule for one and one rule for the other. And certainly as a police officer, being stuck in the middle of two opposing views, that is the view I'd have to take and be completely impartial. Whether it was resistance or protest, it was the actions to resist or protest that would be how I would judge, dare I say.
And you've drawn another important distinction there between your interpretation of this question as an individual, but also as a representative of the state. And the state has a very clear or a significant role within protest, whether it facilitates protest, whether it stops protest. So firstly, Andrew, where do you see the role of the individual, the role of the state, and any potential conflict between the two?
So the individual has a conscience, which can be challenged by what they see going on around them. And they may very well feel that as an individual, that person needs to dissociate themselves from something that's happening or associate themselves with something good that's happening. The state, on the other hand, its primary role, I would suggest, is to, well, Daniel put it as facilitate the rights of the individual to freedom of speech and association, so that individuals are able to make their voices heard by means of protest if they want to, or by means of the ordinary democratic process as well. there may be times when the state does things that individuals need to protest against as well. And Izzy's given the example of wanting to change the law. The individual, of course, as a member of the society which the state governs, you could argue if they don't exercise their right to protest, then there is a sort of acquiescence. And an individual, that's the point at which an individual may feel that their conscience is telling them that they need to take a stand, that they need to protest in order not to be not to acquiesce or not to be quiescent, not to agree by their silence with something unjust that's going on. I would suggest that if the question is whether one is just or passionate, well, I would suggest that Jesus is both. He's a man whose cause is just, and he is a very passionate person. You can tell this from the Gospels. That doesn't mean that anything goes for him. It means that he takes a stand, for example, on hypocrisy and corruption that he sees going on around him. But he's very clear about where the boundaries of that lie. He's very clear about what amounts to legitimate protest and what doesn't.
Thank you. And Izzy?
So what was this to do with the state? Different?
Yeah, the role of the individual and the role of the state, and any conflict between the two.
Yes, and clearly there were always going to be times when individuals have different opinions and their conscience will tell them something different to the state. And I do think it's really important there is some way for them, some outlet for them, whether, obviously in a peaceful way, to be able to show that their opinion differs from the state, and to a necessary campaign to have a law change. We all know from looking at history that bad laws can be made. That laws have been made that are very damaging to people, and that at times large portions of society can be blinded to that. Unfortunately, have only been awakened sometimes, even by small groups of individuals who have been able to awaken people's sense of reasoning, awaken their consciences by peaceful means. And so, yes, I do think it's very important that we do this in a peaceful manner, and that we respect other individuals whilst doing this. And that's why I was saying that the work that we do would always come from a place of love. Now, I know that can sound a bit trite, but I think even when we were looking at Jesus's anger, which Father Andrew was talking about, we can see that even his anger is born of love for his Father's house when he is cleansing the temple. And so I think even if we might be very passionate, and that might be a kind of anger, it's a loving anger. So we don't start lashing out in hatred. So yes, I do think that the state should obviously has a clear place in this, in upholding those laws. But I think if people don't have a right to challenge those laws in a peaceful manner, then I think that could be a very dangerous place for a society, because once a bad law is made, how do we ever go back? How is that ever shared with other people? If we're not allowed to protest, are we only allowed to kind of speak about it in hushed whispers to those that we know share the same opinion? But rightly, there needs to be some kind of line that we do not step over. Even when we're challenging something which is very unjust, we need to be respectful, even of the rights of those who disagree with us, in not behaving violently or aggressively towards them, even if just for the sake of our own cause, because that rarely gets people on the side of your own cause. If you're behaving in a violent or aggressive manner, that doesn't help people to see your perspective. But of course, aside from that, I think from a Christian perspective, we need to be respectful of other people's basic human rights.
No, thank you. And I must say, I really like your description of this almost controlled anger, an anger rooted in kindness. And it makes me immediately think of Martin Luther King's approach, that yes, you may have a cause that absolutely drives you from your core, but ultimately you are protesting in that society with those people with whom you will have to live in the future. So the intrinsic interrelatedness of all of these issues coming together. So that's the first half hour, folks, of this discussion. So what I propose we do now is open it up for questions to the panel. So I will do my best to look for waving hands. Apologies if I get your names wrong when I come to you, but so any questions? David.
Me?
David and Margaret I've got, yeah.
Right, okay. There's an obvious something that has been read into all of this is the quality of the state. And we're sort of assuming that the state, and yes, we do live in a relatively fair state, but if you don't see that, then I think much of what's been said shifts. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, first they came for these, then those, then that, then they came for me, and there was no one left to protest. Yeah, and an awkwardness too. Christianity is about love, etc., etc. And we can say that God is not violent, but God, in conventional theology, God certainly does not stop people going to hell. You can't be more awful than that. I think I'd prefer to be whipped in the temple. Sorry, so state, and I think we have to be a bit careful on Christianity always being loving.
Yeah. I don't know if any of the panelists would like to come back on David's questions, observations. Danny.
So I think it's a very good point, very good question, David. Thank you. So that is perhaps one of the reasons why, whilst the Western ethical tradition is arguably based on Judeo-Christian ethics, the police operate a secular approach in terms of our drive for policing without fear, favour or prejudice. The history of the police service is inextricably linked with the history of public order. If you think back to the early to mid 1800s and the Peterloo massacre, one of the driving forces behind having a civilian police service is to make sure that public order and public disorder wasn't met with military force. It's probably very easy for me to say, as somebody who's spent most of his adult life as a police officer, I've had my fair share of accusations of being a fascist in various guises and being part of a totalitarian state. But I think the fact that we're even having this communication and my colleagues aren't knocking on your doors as we speak is a good indication of the degree of freedom that we have, whether that is to hear people whose views that we disagree with. And I think it's important. I've never met a protester who didn't believe they were right about their point, whether that's somebody who's on the left wing of politics, the right wing of politics, or anywhere or any other stripe in between. So the principle of Christianity is respectfully irrelevant to our process of policing protest, because regardless of your background, views, upbringing, we will police you exactly the same in as fair a manner as possible, or as at least equally unfair a manner as possible, arguably.
Thanks, Danny. Just before I come to John, anything from Izzy or Andrew?
I guess maybe just touching on what was said about questioning love being a motive, and I guess that comes back to what I was saying about how sometimes we can see that as being a little bit trite, that love has to be something all kind of sweet and sugary. Whereas that certainly isn't something that the position that I would be taking or trying to put forward to anyone else. Love can be something very firm, and as we see, you know, as Father Andrew was pointing out, instances where Jesus, although I believe every action that Jesus took would be one that was born out of love, they can still be very disciplined actions, and could be very, if from his perspective, he could be issuing judgment upon people in a very disciplined manner. So yeah, I don't necessarily think that because we're talking about love that we have to sort of think that we're kind of only being sugary sweet to each other. Sometimes that might be taking another form, but obviously that would require limitations where we still care about the person who has a completely different view to us, who even is being violent to us or is even threatening us, that we would still care about that person. And I think that's where love would come in, and that's what I mean when I say that it's got to be born out of love, that we never cease caring about loving for the other person and think that our movement or our cause is so important that we can disregard an individual.
Thank you.
So
Andrew?
perhaps, Ben, I should say something about David's last point about God. And I think if I understood it correctly, David's challenge was, well, how could a God who allows people to go to hell be characterized as peaceful? I'm glad that David put it like that, allows, because the way I would try and characterize it is that God doesn't run a totalitarian state. He respects the freedom of every person. And that includes the freedom to reject God, actually. So if the question is why does God allow people to separate themselves from him, perhaps even forever, I think the answer is because he respects our freedom too much to impose his love and mercy on us.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to next question from John Staples.
Hello, and thank you to all the panel. The thing that occurs to me is that we have a very different culture in this country as far as policing is concerned, which is very, very much from what Father has just said about the respect for individual conscience. We have policing essentially by consent in this country. I have connections in America where the culture of the police is very different indeed. And I wonder what the panelists would feel like if they were in Hong Kong at the moment. If you were in the police force in Hong Kong, how would you react?
Thank you. So I suppose that's naturally a question for Danny first off.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I think if you were to consider it as being almost like a Star Trek model of being beamed into Hong Kong now, so me with my upbringing background, my 23 years of policing, suddenly becoming a Hong Kong police officer, it would probably be the antithesis of what I'm used to or what I find is acceptable. And perhaps it would be antithesis to what the public that I serve would expect as well. So the Pelian principles that have been in place since the police service started make a great point of how the fact that the police service are simply the public in uniform. The only difference between myself and a member of the public is that the duties of care to each other are something that I take on a full-time basis, perhaps wear a uniform to identify the fact that I'm doing that, arguably. I suppose make no mistake that there are times where the law must be enforced, and policing by consent doesn't mean that you can just withdraw your consent from certain laws. Otherwise, we would potentially have a state of anarchy. I'm not suggesting that you would personally, John. I shan't be looking you up later, I promise. But ultimately, we do everything we can to make sure that even if we are challenged by members of the public and people who are angry towards the police, people who disagree with the police, they still get to have their say. There's a great degree of of acceptance, of latitude into what is acceptable during a protest that perhaps might not be acceptable on a day-to-day basis. And the environment and location can have a big impact on that. But specifically to answer that question about Hong Kong, that is not the police service that I joined. It's not the police service that I or the vast majority of my colleagues will want to represent. And actually, I do very much support as an individual the right to protest, because that's how we do make change. And ultimately, in a democratic society, there's somebody who isn't going to get their way, somebody who didn't get the person voted for that in power, and some laws that people disagree with. It's our job to peacefully stand in the middle and allow that protest. I don't want to see police officers firing guns into crowds and choosing hitting people with a stick as the first option. That is not what the vast majority of police officers I serve with would want to do either.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. Is policing by consent your experience?
So I have to say that all the interactions we've had with the police have been really positive in this country. You know, with my work in Birmingham or in London, which have been the main two areas that I've been focused on. But I do think it's a very interesting point of where you go with this when you're moving to maybe a totally different state where maybe unjust, not just unjust laws, but laws are being enforced unjustly, maybe using physical aggression. People aren't allowed to protest. You know, if police are being unjust with violence that's being used against protesters. So personally, I think self-defense is acceptable. Physical self-defense. So if a police officer was being physically aggressive with a protester, I think you know within your rights to defend yourself. You know, obviously the police force that Daniel's representing is one that would not be necessary. You would not need to defend yourselves against them there, because they're there to protect you if you're working within the law. But I do think it's a really interesting point of what happens when not just unjust laws happen, but laws are being pushed onto you in an unjust manner. How far you can go with defending yourself if you just want to peacefully protest. And I think it could become a case that you do need to physically defend yourself if that was the case and you lived in that kind of society. And I do believe that would be acceptable.
Great, thank you. And Andrew.
Okay, well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer has already been mentioned, and obviously he lived in a society where things had got beyond protest, where the heroes that we think about from that era are the people who resisted. There are other examples that I can think of historically where actual resistance has been necessary. I think Dr. King was mentioned by you earlier, Ben, and although he was a man of peace, it wasn't all indirect. He and his fellow protesters went places where the law said they shouldn't go. And his whole point was that what he was doing would have been allowed for him if he was white. That was the point of his protest. And so, John, you mentioned the difference in culture between policing in this country and in the United States, and there was those terrible images, weren't there, from Birmingham of police officers hitting protesters with sticks, setting dogs on them, fire hoses, all of those sort of things. The same kind of images that we're seeing now in Hong Kong. I think what I'd say to the people of Hong Kong is that actually against the Chinese Communist Party, you are not going to win fighting. What you may very well do is get a place in the history books as a hero, but the chances are that you'll be destroyed. Another way of doing it might be to look at the way in which people obtained their liberation in Eastern Europe in the 80s. And in particular solidarity in Poland. Perhaps the most effective protest, if you like, protest of the whole era was a public mass that Pope John Paul II held in Poland, where 1 million people turned up and simply were present together with God for mass. It wasn't the only one. There were many other peaceful protests across Eastern Europe at the time, but what looked like a sort of unconquerable force, the Soviet Union, eventually gave in. And I hope that actually that same resolution in observing peaceful protest might be the answer in Hong Kong. If I was there, I have to say, to answer John's question directly, I would be terrified. I'd be looking over my shoulder at mainland China and thinking, you know, Catholic priests over there are either approved by the state or they're in prison. So yes, I would be very afraid of that.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think we've got time for another question. And I'm just scanning through the pictures.
So I think we have Virginia and LM.
Yeah.
So.
LM, I don't know your name. You're just on mute still.
Linda.
There you go.
Linda.
Hello, Linda.
I mean, with all things, there's everybody, 50% think they're right and 50% say they're wrong. So you've always got to find the middle path. I'd like to ask you, you've been in the echo, or your police force has been in the echo quite regularly since the protesters about anti-virus, anti-COVID, and saying it's not a nonsense. And some of your police have actually got COVID now because of it. How do you feel about the protesters then? And the fact also that some of them came from out of our area into our area, which is surely breaking some agreement or law or statute that we're all supposed to stay in our own areas. What have you done about them, and how are you getting your message across that we don't want these people in Bournemouth? The majority of people are behaving themselves, working with everybody and the NHS. They are not just protesting about that, they're protesting about our rights and our NHS and everything. So what are you going to do about them?
Thank you. Danny, I'll let you answer that one first. I'm happy to come in as well on that one.
Thank you, Linda, for that question. So I have been involved directly with those protests in previous weeks as the commander on the ground. So if I try to answer them in order, if I can. So under the Human Rights Act, everyone has a right to have their voice heard. They have the right to protest, and the right of freedom of association to do that and to express themselves. It's not arguing semantics. That right wasn't taken away under COVID regulations. What the COVID regulations said was basically everyone can't get together and go out. And there are certain exceptions to that. For example, being able to go out for a medical need, being able to go out to get food and other essentials and exercise. One of the exemptions was not protest. So the effect is the same, that you can't go out and protest during this time of a lockdown under the COVID regulations. Certain people have chosen to ignore that. You could argue that goes down to that difference between resistance and protest. And I think this is a classic example where each of those individuals genuinely believes that they are doing the right thing. They believe that they are correct in what they do. They believe that I dare say, to steal Izzy's phrase, they're doing it from a place of love to try and to avoid us all being corralled by what they see as government control, and everything along a spectrum, which goes everything from they're not quite sure they agree with some of the data to what might be described as conspiracy theories. In terms of my feelings around that, Again, I don't have the luxury perhaps of expressing feelings around that from the police perspective. What I would say is the law is clear. I would, as with every protest, adopt a position of policing, again, as you said, without fear, favour or prejudice, without offering an opinion, upholding the law, and doing that in a way which justice is done and seen to be done. Personally, I'm very sad to see anyone get COVID and the effects it can have on them. I have at least one officer on my team who is suffering with it at the moment, and it's not a comfortable place to be. I've had to self-isolate, which has meant that I've had time away from physical contact with my family, which is with a young child at home is very, very difficult. However, I would also say that part of my duty as a police officer is to put myself in a position where that is perhaps more likely than others. I think the point Linda made there is a classic point in terms of the question for this forum, does anything go? At what point do your rights as a protester override those rights of the majority of people who disagree with you? Now, it's easy to say, we disagree with this individual, this group, but I dare say there's a large percentage of people in Southern America, in the US, who disagree with Dr. Martin Luther King and felt that he was a rabble-rouser and a troublemaker. And ultimately, what he was doing was against the law at that time. Now, we can look back with perhaps arguing more enlightened lenses now and see that he was right and he brought about some great change. But I dare say that the COVID protesters would all say in 50 years' time, they'll be hailed as heroes as well. So I think you've hit, Linda, on the nail of the problem there, of who is, inverted commas, right in protest.
Thanks, Danny. Izzy, what are your thoughts?
Well, we're obviously specifically with regards to that, I can understand that at the moment there are rules about protesting. So I think, we need to be careful to try and obey the laws if unless the laws themselves are unjust. And I can't see at the moment that specifically the law is so unjust in that area. I guess kind of picking up on what Father Andrew was saying about at some point there becomes a sort of a divergence, if you like, of how far you can go. And one of the things that's come to my mind just while this has been going on is I don't know if anyone's watched the film called Carol about Pope St. John Paul II, and there's a moment in that when it's during the war and through communism afterwards, where you see that a lot of his friends, people that he grew up with, decide to take the point of view of using violence in more of a resistance towards either the Nazis or towards communism. And you see the different path that he takes towards maybe using the weapon of the pen and then ultimately the weapon of faith. And I guess that's going to very much depend on our own foundations, whether we have any faith, whether we ultimately believe that we are solely going to be the ones who are solving these problems, or we believe in a divine being, in a God who himself will help us if we truly ask him. And obviously that's going to be something which is a huge topic. But I believe for those of us who are Christians, there has to be a limit to what we do with what we do, into how far we can go, particularly coming back to what Lynn was saying. If we think that we're risking other people's health, their livelihoods with what we're doing, then I think we have to at least question what we're doing, if we're posing risks to other people. And I think you maybe look at more also from a spiritual perspective of what we can do to ask for God's help in a situation. And I can see that's where a divergence can lie, depending on what our own beliefs are, as to whether we believe there is someone higher that we can ask for help, or whether it all rests solely on our shoulders of solving a situation.
Thank you. We are getting close to time, but I'll come to Andrew.
Yes, well, I know Virginia has a question as well, so I won't spend too long answering this, if I may. I would just associate myself with Izzy's perspective. I think we have to put this into the hands of God, and part of doing that is to pray for our political representatives, our police, our judges, our lawyers, our local councillors, and I think my reaction to that is to the situation is to do that.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us on just so we can get Virginia's question in this last few moments.
My question was similar to Linda's, actually. It was just to say that I didn't think at the moment that protests were allowed. And if there are more of them, what were you going to do about it, or could you do anything about it? So it was very similar to Linda's, really.
So I think that, go on, Danny.
Well,
Yeah.
I was going to say, without wishing to repeat myself, I think there's two key aspects there. One is what we're going to do about it, and also what would you like us to do about it, and what would be acceptable. So we do everything we can to engage with the people involved and try and negotiate. There are things going on behind the scenes you wouldn't see. So in terms of dealing with a protest, sometimes whilst prevention is better than cure, there are times where enforcement takes place after the fact, where people might be fined, for example. Dealing with protest is relatively very easy. Dealing with it ethically is very difficult. So if you want us to stop it, we can, but then we'll start to look like Hong Kong. And I don't think that will do anyone any favors. So it's a very fine balancing act. It's the idea of walk softly and carry a big stick, I imagine will be a fair analogy there. So there are times where needs must, and prevention and enforcement aren't robust actions would take, because the consequence behind that would undo the good character that the police enjoy so far, and the good relationships we have with the wider public.
Great, thanks, Danny. And I'll just come to our panelists for some closing thoughts. So, Andrew.
Thank you. Yes, the one thing that's been mentioned several times, I think, is the particular relationship that the police have with people in this country. And I think it's something that we really need to be thankful for, especially the fact that right from the beginning, our people were clear that we didn't want a police force that acted as a tool of the state, but rather one that acted as a friend and servant of the people. So when we're talking about protest, the police, I think my experience has always been in this country, attempt to allow everybody to express themselves, express their point of view within the law. I think any protester has to understand that as soon as they step outside the law, they're going beyond protest. They're going into the realm of resistance. And as long as, although there have been examples in history where resistance has been justified, I think until it gets to the point where we feel that we no longer live in a free and democratic society, it's incumbent on us when we protest to do so within the limits of the law.
Thank you very much. And Izzy.
Yeah, I would totally concur with what Father Andrew has said there, and that it must be incredibly hard to police fairly sometimes, considering the passion with which some protests are held, and with the aggression that some protests are held. So my respect does go out to the police force, and I think as Christians, for those of us here who are, I think, or for those of us who believe in a God, I think it would be well to maybe add this to our prayer list, to pray for them, that they can be truly unbiased and fair in the work they do, which I think is hard for any of us, if we're truly honest. Maybe making sure that we can truly try and see things from other people's perspective, and not just our own, and to be being truly fair with others. So I do think that for those of us who are Christians, prayer has got to be the underlying force behind that. And again, agreeing with what Father Andrew says about how it's not saying that there is never a time when resistance shouldn't happen. I think that there has been times through history that we've looked at through this when a resistance is necessary. But I think we need to think very long and hard before we take that step, because it is a huge step. Once we go outside the law, we can't expect the law to be there for us anymore if we are ourselves breaking it. So it needs to be a very, very well thought out step if that's what somebody deems is necessary.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the conclusion of our hour. Thank you very much to our panelists, to Andrew, Izzy and Danny. Thank you to everybody who's joined today, and in particular thank you to Ian for facilitating this session. As I promised, the discussion never ends up where it started. Another really rich discussion, and I do hope that you can join us next week when we will be looking at our next question, Big Brother rules, telling the story the only possible way. Is it ethically justifiable to attempt to build communities of character?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Ian.